Okay, so what the claim I'm making is this. Human chimp ancestry is not absolutely true according to scientists or philosophers of science. It is actually an assumption which they try and verify by looking at genomes and by looking at anatomy. And when they go out and do that, they do actually come across some issues. Now, one of the issues they come across is homoplasia, where you have similarities. Now, we were talking about the paternity test. That was to do with humans, where we know already that common ancestry is there because it happens in front of us. So that's a false analogy. But when I can bring in front of you two genomes, and I can ask you, James, right? James, right? I can say to you, James, do they share a common ancestor? Imagine they look 99% identical. Would you say yes or no?
You'd say that they probably do share a common ancestor.
Do. We know in genetics and in biochemistry of things which are identical which do not have a common ancestor.
Do you mean the entire genome or a particular gene?
The recent common ancestor. So for example, the placental saber-toothed tiger and the marsupial saber-toothed tiger. When you look at them, they have a lot of similarities, striking similarities. But the placental saber-toothed tiger is closer to the kangaroo than it is to the marsupial saber-toothed tiger.
Yeah.
Now the similarities between human beings and pigs exist genetically which do not exist between human beings and chimpanzees.
But
so
overall,
how do you explain this?
But overall, we possess a much greater overlap of our genes, like between chimps, than we do between pigs.
Sure.
And the reason, and that's not based on an assumption. That's like the reason why that we believe that that's evidence for having a shared common ancestor is because genetically we look at how DNA behaves and we observe that kind of there's a certain normal rate of genetic mutation unless there's unless there's extra presence of mutagens. And so we know that, like, given that kind of DNA mutates at a certain rate over time, like the closer kind of two organisms are in DNA, that provides good evidence that they have a closer common ancestor. Because it would be very rare that kind of two kind of totally unrelated organisms would happen to mutate to become more similar. It would be much more likely that they'd mutate to become less similar. So it could be that kind of a particular organism like a pig could by chance mutate a similar gene to an organism that it isn't very closely related to. Just by chance, and they both evolve that same gene independently. But that would happen much less frequently than a gene arising once and then being passed on to both new subsequent species.
Now, what you've explained there is the maximum likelihood method.
Yeah.
You're speaking there. All I'm actually saying about that particular method which they use, which is the conventional way they work out relationships of the tree of life. All I'm saying about that is it's still based on a number of assumptions.
Okay, but like all sciences, and yet we still trust science.
I'm not saying not to trust it. What I'm saying is we should know and understand. It's not saying is that literally true.
Okay, but that's not a very bold claim though, because the same is true of all science.
Now, maximum likelihood. Tell me which one of these assumptions is wrong in maximum likelihood. Firstly, there is the assumption that human beings, regardless of what evidence exists out there, we have a common ancestor with something out there naturally. That's just an assumption in science, which is naturalism. So we cannot accept a human being appeared in the history of life without being linked to something else. That's one assumption. The second assumption is of natural selection being the mechanism by which you have change. And I'm going to speak about this because this adds up as something. Okay, one second. Okay, homology is an assumption again, and the assumption of a single origin. Now, this assumption of natural selection.
None of those are. All of those are misrepresentations of what's believed in conventional biology.
How? No one says. Which one of these four?
Okay, could you repeat the first one, because that was definitely wrong. Yeah,
naturalism.
So could you repeat it just once more?
Okay. So, for example, Gareth Nelson, he explains it best. He's an evolutionary biologist and an atheist. He says we have to have ancestors as human beings. We'll pick those. Why? Because they're the best candidates and they have to be there. Okay. What he's basically saying there is methodologically, because scientists ascribe to something known as naturalism, we have to have an ancestor, a non-human ancestor, with something natural out there. it's not possible using science to assume that human beings came in the history of life without being linked to something else natural.
No, like an astute scientist should say is that kind of there is much more evidence that human beings arose via kind of these mechanisms, like kind of being reproduced. There's much more evidence for that than assuming that they popped out of the figment of some deity, and so we should adopt the assumption which best fits the evidence we have at hand. And so kind of a much better working kind of model, the model we should adopt is that kind of, just like kind of, we were given birth to, kind of our previous organism was given birth to, we should kind of proceed in that view and adopt that model rather than adopting a model which doesn't have any evidence to support it, apart from a book of, what's that called? Being sensible, being logical.
No, it's not. It's actually called methodological naturalism.
Hold on. Methodological naturalism. There's two types, and your friend Hamza Sortis explains this.
Hang on a second. You were supposed to challenge the assumption, not verify it. You just verified it.
In what way?
You said I misrepresented, and these assumptions aren't there. But you just showed me yourself that assumption exists.
No, I didn't assume like there can be no such thing as magic. What I said was that the model that kind of human beings kind of were reproduced and like came about via reproduction rather than something magical or some kind of being's divine intervention or divine providence or molding people out of magical clay or that sort of thing. That there's much more evidence to support the model that human beings came about via like these natural processes, or what you would call natural processes.
What you're doing is this: you're conflating methodological naturalism with philosophical naturalism.
No, I think that's what you assumed that I did.
Because scientists, here's what they do: when they are looking at a particular subject, a patient, they put on the lenses of methodological naturalism. They assume there's no soul. They assume the brain is simply the mind the mind is simply the brain at work. This is known as methodological naturalism. Now, philosophical naturalism, the belief that nature is all that there's out there, you're conflating these two. Okay, now let's go back to what I said, and which is why I explained it and I wanted you to challenge it, but you haven't challenged it so far. I said that human chimp ancestry or anything in the tree of life is still based upon these four assumptions. The first thing I said is methodological naturalism, and so far you've only verified it. Not only have you verified it.
I've said that. I've not like taken it. I've not just like kind of jumped. I've not leapt to the conclusion.
The common mistake which is done is you've confused that with philosophical naturalism.
No, I haven't. Like I'm aware of like kind of the difference between methodological and philosophical naturalism.
So,
no, I've said that like one model has evidence to support it. The other model has no evidence.
No. That's an assumption.
Okay. So what's the evidence to support kind of creationism?
Perfect. Let's stop there for a second. Now what's happened so far is this. You've agreed, scientists agree to methodological naturalism. Now you're asking why you're making an argument for philosophical naturalism. Now,
I'm not. No.
You're saying why is creationism better than this, which is philosophical naturalism? Well, you're not saying that.
No, but like, the way I would understand, if I said I'm a philosophical naturalist, then I would be asserting that kind of nothing in nature occurs through supernatural means or divine intervention. I'd just be kind of taking that as an assumption, rather than what I'm doing is I'm kind of looking at two different models for how we came about. One model which has kind of evidence supporting it, and the other model which just has a book of fairy tales.
Now, sir, what you're doing now is you're going beyond the remit of science.
Okay. Yeah, I'm happy to be philosophical as well.
So let's leave that discussion about whether naturalism or supernaturalism is the best worldview to the end. All I was saying was methodological naturalism is an assumption in science.
Well, no, it sounded like what you said was that philosophical naturalism is an assumption in science.
No.
Okay. So
yeah? So we agree there.
Okay.
Now, here's the thing. Even secular mainstream atheist philosophers of science and evolutionary biologists agree that methodological naturalism and philosophical naturalism are not the same thing, and naturalism itself, philosophical naturalism, is an act of faith.
Yeah.
For example, I'm sure you've heard of Michael Roos, very prominent philosopher of science. This is what he says as well. Now let's move on to the other assumptions, because we know methodological naturalism is there. The other assumption is natural selection.
But hold on, I'm sorry, but like, kind of by calling it an assumption, where that there's an implication there that it's not based on evidence. Whereas, like, in fact, kind of adopting the model that kind of human beings arose just by biological processes, rather than is supported by evidence more than the model that human beings arose by divine intervention.
Okay,
so why are we calling it an assumption when it's really kind of just a a sensible kind of approach, like which is more sensible and which is more well supported?
Now what you're doing is this: you're again doing something in which you are conflating philosophical and methodological by saying the success of methodological leads to philosophical.
No, but
that's what you said.
No, because I'm not saying that I'm not saying we should claim it. Because if I was assuming philosophical naturalism, then I'd assume there can never be any divine intervention. Okay, I haven't done that. What I've said is that in terms of which model is more supported when it comes to the arrival of human beings, I have weighed up the evidence, and one model is more well supported. That doesn't mean I'm ruling out any divine intervention in the future. So I'm not being a philosophical naturalist.
The discussion about whether naturalism or supernaturalism best explains human beings, morality, consciousness, everything else, design, we could talk about in the end. For now, let's stick to these 4 assumptions. So methodological naturalism is there.
But it isn't a different question, though.
It is a similar question, but what we're speaking about here
it relates very specifically to whether scientists are assuming that there can't be any kind of divine intervention.
Methodological naturalism is a working assumption in science. This is according to the standard understanding of all philosophers of science. If you don't disagree with that, you can. I'm just saying it's an assumption there. Can I ask you, sir? Now, 1 second, sir. Natural selection is another assumption because no amount of similarities in the world is enough to establish that you have common ancestry. You have to have a mechanism. Do you disagree or agree with that?
Okay, you repeat that, sorry?
So, no amount of similarities between human beings or chimpanzees, human beings or pigs, genetically or anatomically, are enough to establish common ancestry. You have to show a mechanism.
Yeah, that's definitely desirable, having a mechanism.
Not desirable, you actually have to have it necessarily.
Yeah, okay, that sounds reasonable,
okay.
Yeah.
So that's also an assumption, that natural selection leads A to B.
No, it's not an assumption, because that also has evidence supporting it.
Sir, this is the way that science works. You begin off with an assumption or a hypothesis, then you try and verify it, correct?
Okay, but then can we call it a hypothesis? Because assumption has the implication that you're kind of leaping to a conclusion that's just based on a gut feeling or faith rather than based on a logical inference.
I agree.
Okay, so let's say it's a logical inference that kind of natural selection is a mechanism which kind of, fine.
Look, we have some good reasons for this. Number one, there is a lot of propaganda about natural selection and how efficient it is. Just told nonsense.
No, what you're referring to are kind of minor disagreements between kind of biologists who would all agree that there is ample evidence that humans and chimps share a common ancestor.
No, but sir,
so you're pointing to like slight differences in schools of thought.
2 points here. Number one.
You're making a mountain out of a molehill.
Human beings and chimpanzees, you cannot claim common ancestry unless you have a mechanism. You already agreed about that. Number 2. Natural selection, we've been taught for the last 150 years, has great explanatory power, but there's loads of evidence against it. And in fact, just 2 years ago, the Royal Society in London, the most prestigious science society in the world, a whole group of scientists came together, atheist evolutionary biologists, and guess what the main question was? Does natural selection work? So the public thinks natural selection works.
That's misrepresenting it.
Really?
Yeah.
So what were they talking about?
They were talking about 2 different schools, the modern synthesis versus the extended synthesis.
Right,
yes.
Fantastic.
And they actually agree on like a great deal. They only have minor disagreements.
Wait, no, that's not true. That's not true.
Yes, it is.
Hang on.
Would any of the biologists at that event dispute that there is good evidence that humans and chimpanzees share a common common ancestors?
No.
None of them would disagree on that.
None of them would.
Based on their evidence and their investigation.
Sure, sir, but that's a complete red herring.
Why is it a red herring?
I'll explain why.
Doesn't it show that they share ample common ground?
Wait. All of them, they believe in human chimp ancestry. All of them were atheists. But here's what Eva Jablanka said.
Are you sure they're all atheists?
Sir, what I'm going to do is this. Whenever I try and reference atheists, I only use those ones who do not believe in God, who do not believe in intelligent design, do not believe in anything like that. Now, Eva Jablanka, here's what she says. She believes in a type of Lamarckian evolution, which is, as you know, an alternative to Darwinian evolution. Now, when she got up there and she tried to explain this, she got challenged by those who believe in Darwinism. Now, the point here is this.
I think what kind of challenge were they presented with?
What she was doing was this. She was putting forth an alternative, which was making them uneasy. Why? Because they automatically realized that by challenging Darwinism, 150 years of propaganda will be unraveled.
No, that's such a misrepresentation.
Which is also why,
that's not true.
Sir, when a secular atheist who recently died, Jerry Fodor, didn't believe in God, when he challenged Darwinian evolution, he was called a secular creationist, even though he didn't believe in God. What does that go to show you? There is pressure in academia by the Darwinists, by people.
Like who?
Okay, read the book The Oldberg 16 by Susan Mazur. She's a Australian journalist. She went out, she interviewed Jerry Fodor and all these guys. This is what they said in their book, in the book The Oldberg 16. She says that when she was interviewing him, he said, "I'm being called a secular creationist because I'm challenging Darwin." Now, here's what some other scientists
But what do you mean by them challenging Darwin?
By them challenging Darwin, challenging natural selection.
But do you mean they're saying that natural selection doesn't happen, or are they saying that natural selection is one of the mechanisms by which biodiversity occurs, but there are other mechanisms and they have been kind of underrepresented in the mainstream discourse?
That's a good question. So let me break it down into two concepts. Natural selection can be broken down into two things. Either it can be a tautology, which is survival of the fittest. We're not talking about that. Clearly, the fittest survive. That's why they survive.
Yeah.
What we're speaking about is, does natural selection lead to biological novelty and body forms and these types of things? So it's a completely different question. Now,
do any of them disagree with that? Do any of them say that natural selection? No. I think that's a total misrepresentation. I think they'd all agree that natural selection does account for speciation, but there are other kind of mechanisms like epigenetics and like
So you do agree epigenetics is an alternative?
Epigenetics that you have kind of
it's not
evidence for.
It's not alternative.
Yeah, it's not. It's an alternative. It's well supported. No. Let's be clear by what we mean by epigenetics. Epigenetics an example of epigenetics would be how kind of whether a gene is turned on or off can be a gene can be turned on during lifetime, and that can be passed on to the next generation.
Is it hereditary?
Yeah, and so we have evidence that's occurring, and so there's no reason why that's at odds with Darwinism. That's accepted, and there's nothing. It's not like kind of there's a big schism or a big rift, or like, oh no, the whole pyramid's come crashing down.
Sir, tell me this. Why is it that academics have spoken about Lamarck being mocked for 200 years?
Because he didn't have any evidence for what he was proposing. He hadn't identified a molecular mechanism like methylation.
You have to be consistent here. Either Darwinian evolution as we have it today, in terms of a gene-centered view, either is compatible with a Lamarckian epigenetic view, or it's not. You can't have it both ways.
Like the mainstream kind of, there's nothing in the mainstream view on evolution that says epigenetics doesn't occur, because we have evidence that epigenetics occurs.
And how?
And so
when did we get that evidence?
It was pretty recent. It's probably like 25 years ago or something.
Since that evidence has been coming out, what does it show? It actually shows you have adaptation, which is not Darwinian.
Yeah. Okay, but we don't need to be.
You agree it's adaptation, which is not Darwinian?
Sure, but there's no.
It's not even. What do you mean? It's not adaptation. The adaptation doesn't work like that. It's not adaptation.
Well, I'd say it's adaptation. I don't have a problem with that word.
But it's adaptation, which is non-Darwinian.
Sure, but like what?
There you go. So it's an alternative.
So is genetic drift.
Yes.
Yeah, and
which
so
is why
there's nothing wrong with theories evolving and finding.
Genetic drift is another form of non-Darwinian evolution.
But we're not bound to say Darwin was 100% correct.
Do you agree with that? Do you agree genetic drift is also another example of non-Darwinian evolution?
It's a form of evolution that he kind of hadn't considered.
Okay, sure.
But there's no reason why we need to be bound to what Darwin. This is what you always do. You kind of conflate the modern synthesis and the biological mainstream with Darwinism, and you just leap forwards and backwards
but
and say,
sir,
oh, did Darwinism know about this? Oh, then Darwinism is wrong.
Sir.
But like, then just a few minutes ago, you're talking about the modern synthesis, which is like closer
Sir,
to
when
what
I
we're
refer to
talking about.
Darwinism, I'm speaking about the gene-centered modern synthesis view. I'm not
Okay,
talking about
and there's nothing.
Darwin.
no,
Darwin
no,
didn't
but
know
like
about genes.
but genetic drift, like, there's nothing kind of contradictory to the gene-centered view about genetic drift.
Well, of course there is.
Okay, explain it.
Because you have non-Darwinian evolution.
No,
And in
no,
fact,
no, but it's gene-centered, though.
Sir, in 1975,
genetic drift is just probability.
When
no one would argue against it.
When genetic drift was published academically, the first thing it was